Hello, my name is Steve. Welcome to American Steam Legacy. This video is part 3 of a 6-part series dedicated to the Whyte notation. We'll be taking a brief look at the 10 and 12 coupled locomotives of the Whyte notation and some of the more noteworthy locomotives of each type. This is by no means an exhaustive collection of 10 and 12 coupled locomotives, so if there's a wheel configuration you would like covered in a future video, please leave a comment down below. So coming up next are the noteworthy 10 and 12 coupled locomotives of the Whyte notation on American Steam Legacy. In the world of full adhesion locomotives, the 010 didn't catch on in the U.S. nearly as much as it did elsewhere around the world. Only 9 American railroads rostered the type, with their respective fleets numbering fewer than 5. The New York Central and the Chesapeake and Ohio were exceptions, maintaining 13 and 15 010s respectively. All told, 40 examples of the 010 were produced in the U.S., with an additional 7 being converted from 210-2 Santa Fe's by their respective railroads. The Baltimore and Ohio owned only 2 010s, accounting for 2 of the 7 conversions, while the Alabama and Vicksburg converted 5 Santa Fe's to add to their 2 purpose-built 010s already in service. The 010 was built sporadically between 1868 and the early 1930s, with the later examples being equipped with superheaters. The Alton Southern Railroad's lone example, built by Baldwin in 1931, featured a booster in the tender's leading truck. While most locomotives of this type were pulled from service by the early 1940s, the Chesapeake and Ohio and the Duluth, Mesabi, and Northern Railroads would keep theirs in service into the mid-1950s. The first American 010 was built by Reuben Wells, master mechanic for the Jeffersonville, Madison, and Indiana Railroad in 1868. Wells developed this locomotive specifically to tackle the 5.9% grade on Madison Hill in Madison, Indiana, since no other locomotive could climb this grade without a helper. Named the Reuben Wells in honor of its builder, the locomotive was able to push 150 tons up the Madison grade single-handedly. With a boiler pressure of 130 psi and drive wheels 44 inches in diameter, the Reuben Wells could develop 25,335 pounds of tractive effort, which was quite good for the time period. Fortunately, the Reuben Wells has been preserved and is on display at the Children's Museum of Indianapolis in Indianapolis, Indiana. The first 210 type locomotive to appear in the U.S. was built for the Lehigh Valley Railroad in the late 1860s. The 10-coupled drive wheels provided better adhesion, while the 2-wheel pilot gave better riding qualities at speed. However, these early decapods, as they became known in the U.S., were hard on the track and fell out of favor over the next 15 years. The type reappeared when the Northern Pacific received 2 decapods in 1886 from Burnham, Parry, Williams and Company. The Northern Pacific put their decapods to work on the steep switchbacks of Stampede Pass, where they were successful due to their high adhesion. The 210 didn't begin to gain some popularity in the U.S. until after World War I, albeit from geopolitical events. Imperial Russia ordered 1,200 of the type from U.S. manufacturers, but the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 halted the delivery of over 200 of the locomotives, leaving them stranded in the U.S. These locomotives were modified to U.S. standards and were quickly snapped up by American railroads in 1918. Between 1891 and 1930, approximately 900 decapods were produced for domestic railroads, with the Pennsylvania Railroad boasting a fleet that accounted for more than half of all the 210s built in the U.S. at 558. The first 123 arrived in 1916, with the majority being built in the Pennsylvania Railroad's Juniata shops in Altoona, Pennsylvania. 425 more would arrive from Baldwin in 1922. The 425 Baldwins would comprise the I-1S Type E class. While they weren't the heaviest 210s built, they did boast the highest tractive effort for the type at 102,000 pounds. The I-1S class was also notable for an unusually high boiler pressure of 250 psi. The presence of a Type E superheater and a Worthington BL2 feed water heater enhanced the overall efficiency of the class. However, the largest gain in efficiency was due to a very short cutoff of 50% at a time when 70 to 80% was the norm. The short cutoff resulted in a significantly more efficient use of steam, and the feed water heater resulted in a reduction in coal consumption of 14%. While none of the Pennsylvania's decapods were preserved, 11 locomotives of this wheel arrangement have been preserved and are on static display, while two more are operational. At first glance, the 210-2 Santa Fe would appear to be the logical progression from the 210-0 decapod, but since the Pennsylvania Railroad was able to get more than adequate steaming capacity from their decapods, the addition of a trailing truck to facilitate a larger firebox would seem unnecessary. Oddly enough, this isn't too far from the truth. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe owned a pair of decapods and used them as helpers on freight trains through Raton Pass, California. After the freight had cleared the pass, the helpers were no longer needed, and they would cut off and head back down the mountain in reverse since there were no turning facilities available. Given the steep grade and sharp curves, keeping the locomotive on the track was a difficult proposition at best. In 1903, the railroad solved this problem by adding a two-wheel trailing truck to give the decapod better tracking when running backwards. So in other words, the trailer was added to perform the same function as the pilot truck. These decapods, now sporting a trailer and a 210-2 wheel arrangement, became known as the Santa Fe types. Eventually, the two-wheel trailer was used to carry a larger firebox mated to a larger boiler. But the power the Santa Fe was able to produce was more than the engine frame could handle. Engine frames were of the built-up type and held together by a combination of rivets and bolts. A locomotive with the power of the Santa Fe would cause the frame to loosen up, or come unglued, after extended periods of hard use. This would result in wheel sets moving out of alignment, accelerated axle bearing, and wheel flange wear. Simply put, the Santa Fe was just beyond what a build-up frame could handle. The cast steel frame with integrally cast cylinders hadn't arrived yet, and this was one of the things that led to only 2,200 Santa Fes being produced. In 1904, a year after the Santa Fe appeared, another high-powered locomotive made its debut in the U.S. That would be the compound articulated Mallet. The early Mallets suffered from the same drawbacks as the Santa Fe, so railroads that needed high-powered freight locomotives were left with two choices: the Santa Fe or the six-coupled articulated. Basically a choice between the devil we know versus the devil we don't know. The railroads that embraced the Santa Fe type did so almost to the exclusion of compound articulated power, while the reverse was true for railroads that decided to go with the Mallet in heavy freight and heavy drag service. While the 410-2 wheel arrangement is probably most associated with the Baldwin number 60,000, Baldwin didn't originate the type. The Union Pacific and the Southern Pacific were already operating the type by 1925 and owned 59 units combined, the Union Pacific rostering 10, while the Southern Pacific owned 49. The Union Pacific is, however, accredited with naming the 410-2 the Overland type. By the mid-1920s, Baldwin was approaching a milestone. With orders already on the books, they knew they would be building their 60,000th locomotive in short time. Rather than let the 60,000th go out the door as part of a larger order with little fanfare, Baldwin decided to do something that would definitely draw attention and stick in people's memories. With a little juggling of the production schedule and numbering of builders' plates, serial number 60,000 would end up attached to an experimental design Baldwin hoped would take the railroad industry by storm. Baldwin chose the 410-2 wheel arrangement, which was unorthodox and already falling out of favor. In 1926, number 60,000 rolled out of the Eddystone, Pennsylvania plant, sporting not only a water tube boiler operating at 350 psi, but also a water tube firebox. With the furnace gases passing around the boiler tubes instead of through them, the boiler would be much more efficient. Applying the same principle to the firebox eliminated the need for stay bolts on flat surfaces, such as the top and sides of a conventional firebox that would otherwise need them. Number 60,000 was also a three-cylinder design. A high-pressure cylinder mounted inside the frame drove the second set of drive wheels through a connecting rod and exhausted to the two low-pressure cylinders outboard the frame and transmitted power to the wheels through conventional means. A cylindrical six-axle Vanderbilt tender with Baldwin Locomotive Works on its sides rounded out a rather handsome design. Number 60,000 would spend the latter part of 1926 and 1927 undergoing tests on numerous railroads around the country. The first stop was the Pennsylvania Railroad's test facility in Altoona, Pennsylvania. The testing revealed number 60,000 could develop 4,500 horsepower, 82,500 pounds of tractive effort, and attain a top speed of 70 miles per hour. The speed is quite impressive for a locomotive with 63-inch drive wheels. The locomotive was then placed in freight service where it handled trains of 7,700 tons. During trial runs on the Pennsylvania and other railroads, 60,000 proved superior in coal and water consumption when compared to the 210-2 Santa Fe types already in service. While on the Southern Pacific, number 60,000 was converted to an oil burner and fitted with a Southern Pacific six-axle Vanderbilt tender to carry oil instead of coal. The conversion resulted in the locomotive's efficiency falling to unacceptable levels, but the failed conversion to oil is not what led to number 60,000's ultimate demise. While number 60,000 was not the first three-cylinder locomotive, and it wouldn't be the last, nor was it the first conventional locomotive to use compound steam distribution, the railroads took exception to the location of the high-pressure cylinder. Since it was buried inside the frame, accessing it for maintenance was a difficult proposition. But the biggest issue was not only the water tube boiler, but also the firebox having received the same treatment. Conventional fire tube boilers require boiler tubes to be replaced from time to time because the connection between the tube and the tube sheet erodes and begins leaking. Number 60,000's boiler and firebox were rife with such connections, all of which being potential points of failure. With the national tour not resulting in so much as one order, number 60,000 returned to its birthplace in late 1927 with its tail tucked between its legs. To add insult to injury, the locomotive was used as a stationary boiler for a time before being sold to the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, where she enjoys a more dignified life on static display. The story of the 210-4 begins in 1919 when the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad ordered a batch of 76 210-2 Santa Fe types from Baldwin. Baldwin was asked to fit one locomotive, number 3829, with a four-wheel trailer as an experiment. Other than the additional non-driven axle taking some of the weight off the drive wheels, this lone 210-4 was identical to the other 75 Santa Fes in all respects. Number 3829 was the first 210-4 built in the United States, but it was a reworked 210-2 rather than a purpose-built 210-4. The railroad's experiences with this pseudo 210-4 led to inconclusive results, and the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe wouldn't revisit the 210-4 type until 11 years later. Meanwhile, number 3829 would remain in service until being retired and scrapped in 1955. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe's next 210-4 would arrive in 1930. By this time, the 210-4 would be widely known as the Texas type, since the Texas and Pacific would take delivery of the first true 210-4 in 1925. The order comprised of exactly one locomotive built by Baldwin, and upon arrival on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe was given the road number 5000 and named Madam Queen. Number 5000 performed extremely well when compared to the Santa Fe type. Madam Queen could haul 15% more tonnage in 9% less time and consumed 17% less coal per gross ton mile. Surprisingly, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe wouldn't place their first large order for the Texas type until 1938, ordering 10 units from Baldwin, and then a final batch of 25 in 1944, also from Baldwin. While the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe was embracing the 210-4 at a snail's pace, the Chesapeake and Ohio took a different route. The 40 Texas types ordered from Lima in 1930 were definitely superpower locomotives in their own right. With a boiler pressure of 265 psi and an adhesive weight of 373,000 pounds, the T1 class, as they were known on the Chesapeake and Ohio, developed 93,345 pounds of tractive effort. A booster mounted in the trailing truck added an additional 15,275 pounds of tractive effort, bringing the total starting tractive effort to 103,620 pounds. The T1 class would typically handle a trailing load of 160 loaded coal cars totaling 13,500 tons unassisted. The 210-4s built after 1930 would incorporate a trailing truck booster, but due to the booster's huge appetite for steam, they were reserved for starting the train or being cut in if the locomotive was at risk of stalling. The Pennsylvania Railroad borrowed one of the Chesapeake and Ohio's T1s and ran it through its paces. The Pennsylvania was so impressed with the locomotive's performance that it went on to build 125 slightly modified copies in their Juniata shops between 1942 and 1944. Designated the J class, they would be regarded among the finest steam locomotives operated by the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania's 125 210-4s and the Texas and Pacific's fleet of 70 combined would account for almost half of the 400 210-4s built in the U.S. The 412-2 became known as the Union Pacific type not only for the Union Pacific originating the wheel arrangement, but because the Union Pacific was the only American railroad to operate the type. While most Western railroads were using 210-2s or 2880 articulated locomotives in freight service by the mid-1920s, the Union Pacific wanted a freight locomotive that had better riding qualities than the short-drivered Santa Fe's and more speed than the ponderous 8-coupled Mallets. The Union Pacific went to Alco and asked them to design a 412-2 that produced more power, higher speeds, and better riding qualities. Alco delivered the first 412-2 in 1926. The locomotive was numbered 9000 and given the class designation UP1. Later that year, 14 more identical units would arrive from Alco and become the UP2 class, bringing the total to 15. Between 1928 and 1930, 73 more 412-2s would be delivered, all from Alco, and comprising classes UP3 to UP5, bringing the Union Pacific fleet up to a grand total of 88. Like the Baldwin 410-2, the Union Pacific type was a three-cylinder design, but unlike the Baldwin Experiment, all three cylinders received steam directly from the boiler. The center cylinder powered the second set of drivers through a connecting rod and crank arrangement, while the two outboard cylinders powered the drivers by conventional means. Steam was provided by a conventional fire tube boiler at a somewhat low 225 pounds per square inch pressure, but the thermal efficiency was enhanced by a Worthington 4.5 BL type feedwater heater. The four-wheeled pilot truck provided the needed front-end stability, while the 67-inch drive wheels eliminated the pounding that plagued the 210-0 and the 210-2s. The larger drive wheels allowed adequate space for enough weight to be placed in counterbalance of the main rods and drive rods. The Union Pacific type was generally considered a great success. The 412-2 could handle 120-car freight trains at 50 miles per hour. Speeds as high as 60 miles per hour had been reported. In spite of the locomotive's long wheelbase, the 412-2 could negotiate curves up to 16 degrees due to the generous range of motion of its pilot and trailing trucks. The first and last set of drive wheels were equipped with lateral motion devices that provided additional flexibility when negotiating curves. With three 27-inch diameter cylinders, the 412-2 developed 96,646 pounds of tractive effort and could climb grades as steep as 2%. The locomotive would undergo few changes during their service lives. The Worthington 5SA type feedwater heater would replace the unit supplied by Alco. The UP3 class would have their steam dome mounted throttles replaced by the American Throttle Company's front end throttle at the superheater. Of the 88 412-2s built, number 9000 is the sole survivor after being retired in 1956 and is on display in Pomona, California. The remaining 87 were scrapped between 1955 and 1956. I hope you enjoyed the video. Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. And once again, my name's Steve, and thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.